This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert, Kathryn, and I are talking about too much of a good thing. So when you are putting out your novel, maybe it's historical fiction or fantasy, you're doing a ton of world building, a ton of setting work. You're writing it beautifully. It's accurate. It's vivid, but it's just getting in the way of the story. Or maybe it's science fiction and you've got too much science and technology, or a police procedural and the mechanics of what the police officer has to do to solve the crime is just getting in the way of the story. So is there a tipping point we can define? Is it just you know it when you see it? How do you deal with it in your writing? I've stumped the panel.
Yeah, I think we have to put your reader hat on, I suppose, because when you're really immersed in the writing part, it is easy to get lost in the things that either you've spent a lot of time researching or are your own personal passion, and hard to understand if they're really standing in the way of the story. I mean, obviously, your editors, and if you use them, beta readers, etc., will help. But I do find it does help the typical things I'll do when I'm in revision mode, which is printing out, reading that way, or reading on the Kindle. That'll help because you sort of think, oh wow, this went on a bit, didn't it? I've just spent 3 pages describing how the anti-gravitation system works.
Yeah. Can we get to it in the first draft stage? Is it recognizable before we start reading back that manuscript to ourselves or pass it on to other people to look at? Do you find it something you think about as you're drafting?
No, I wouldn't say necessarily think about, but because of the way that I draft, thinking about, I sort of like to think about the scene as having stage markers, and I know what my scene's turning points are. So that helps, I think, move to the story elements that I know I need to hit. But that still doesn't mean that when you go back later, you read it and you think, oh, it's just way too... My problem is not necessarily that I dwell too much on intricate description, but I might spend too much time with characters in dialogue, and it's just not necessary. So I can strip things out there, and it's not that what they're saying is meaningless. I've just enjoyed the conversation when I was writing it. And,
yes.
So yeah, I think the more experience you have, I think, with it in drafting, for sure, I think it comes out cleaner. I think it's it tends to be more of a new writer's problem, that they don't know what the balance is because they don't know what they don't know.
Sure. Yeah, I encountered it recently with a client who had done beautiful work on describing the culture of the civilization, but I could tell just in the storyboard that it was getting in the way of the plot. There were too many scenes that were focused on how people live and how they interact and how they dress and what sort of, lifestyle and events and cultural artifacts they're producing.
Right.
And isn't it an issue of when we love something so much, we put all this energy into the research or the development or the, experience of a thing, and we can become blind to its role in the story, how to make it an effective story element as opposed to just sharing this thing that we're so excited about.
I feel like when it feels like it's becoming a tangent in and of itself, like you said, it can be written really well, and it can feel like this naturally flows into this, and as the writer you can make it quote unquote work, right? But maybe it's actually not actually necessary, and that's where I tend to find myself, is where I'll be like, here's the thing you need to know, and oh yeah, and here's this other cool thing, and then here's this other cool thing, and then all of a sudden I've got 3 or 4 paragraphs that are tangential, interesting, but not necessary for that scene. And then you have to kind of like bring it back. So it's that role in the story. What does my reader need to know right now in this moment?
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's key to keep in mind is what is its role in the story. And when you have something like setting or culture or technology that, you know, is part of the pleasure of reading this genre, you do want to have it in there. It should be part and parcel. But I find the way to do it effectively is to make it the backdrop for the thing that moves the story forward. So if you want to show that the women sit in front of the fireplace with their needlework while the men sit nearby, you know, mending hand tools or something, then maybe the dialogue is the piece that advances the plot or the character arc that's critical to moving the story forward. But the activity is that kind of backdrop piece that shows the culture, the lifestyle, the time period, whatever it is that creates the atmosphere for that story.
Well, and I think that's where you can kind of take your too much of a good thing and put it in. If you mix medium, right? All of a sudden your exposition and is mixed into your dialogue. Instead of just describing your world, you're mixing it in with that plot point. You're mixing it in with the dialogue. Then you can get away with more, right? Because there's more going on. So then your cultural scenes or your world building scenes can really feel like they're much more part of that role rather than just the setting at the beginning and then here comes the action at the end.
Right. And then it's that finding the balance point of when am I going too deep into this activity versus advancing the story. So you want to show them with the embroidery hoops and the needle and the thread, but you don't want to describe it in minutiae so that you halt your scene just to focus on this activity, right? If you really want to do that, then maybe your point of view character, sticks her finger as she's putting the needle through the cloth because she's agitated at something her mother just said to her. And then you get to go a little deeper now. Maybe there's a drop of blood on her embroidery floss and you get to do some more of that intricate description, but you keep it relevant to the moment in the story.
Right, and she better be wearing that embroidery at the climax. And no, I'm just
exactly. Yes. That's funny. How many kitchen sinks can we throw into the climax?
I was thinking when you were talking as well that a good rule of thumb that people may not have heard of is, and I came across this through StoryGrid, although it's not a StoryGrid structural thing. It comes from the world of acting, which is literal action and essential action. So literal action is what the characters are actually doing physically in the scene, and the essential action is the underlying goal or whatever it is that they may not even know, because that's the typical "so what's my motivation?" question.
Right.
But if you pull yourself back to the literal action, so what's the literal action in this scene? And if there are 2 pages where there is 0 literal action, then you've probably gone too far into the side of putting too much setting or explanation or exposition in there. And if you then were to translate that into a movie, for example, that would be the equivalent to a character just standing there while the director panned around the set. So unless your specific intention was to show shock and awe, you do that. That's always doing something. So, like, what reminded me was your example.
You broke up a bit, Robert. You broke up. You said shock and awe, and then the Skype stuttered a bit.
Right. In the shock and awe, unless you were trying to do that deliberately, all it would be is a character, the director panning around the set. So it's not very interesting. So you always want to make sure your characters are in the middle of doing something. That will help, I think, fall back to balance. If you feel you're getting lost in something, come back to, okay, what's the literal action I needed to get across in this particular scene? Like it reminded me where your men and your women were split apart. So the literal action was that the men were tending to one thing, the women were tending to another. So we're reinforcing unconsciously segregation, but we're panning into the zooming into the women, and then one of them pricks their finger. So we've got literal action is prick their finger, but the essential action is that it reminds them that they're still agitated or angry, or it adds to that. So.
Right. I like that. Duality is a way of thinking of balance as well. What is the literal action that is, my characters live in this time and place and this space, this environment, and they need to be doing things in that space, even if it's only reading a book, right? Yeah. What are they doing? Yeah. And then also, essentially, what aspect of the scene is moving the plot forward or the character arc forward? Is it that emotional piece? Is it that event piece? Is it... And you really need both.
That's the story element then. So you've got... Because otherwise, if a novel is just comprised of literal actions strung together, then all it is this happened, then that happened, then this happened, then that happened. And we've probably all read books, even much loved books like that I look at and I think, but I didn't really... Nothing stirred me.
But nothing happened.
Nothing really happened. It was just a whole lot of life.
Right. It's like a 4-year-old telling you a story.
Exactly right. Yeah. And I think some kids' books end up being like that for that reason. And in my view, that's a flaw. I think a story always needs some kind of underlying emotional arc for it to strike at the heart of humanity. But that's a personal opinion. But yeah, it's I just looked it up, and so there's plenty of references on essential versus literal. I think actually might be even in William H. Macy's acting school, it's something that they brought to the fore. Anyway, I think it's a good tool for writers. If you get stuck on a scene, it's a nice way to come back to maybe helping understand where that Goldilocks is.
Yeah.
So have either of you guys ever pared back to so much that you kind of lose the genre feel, though? Because like we were talking about too much of a good thing. Like these are good things, right? Like if you're writing a science fiction or if you're writing procedural, like you want this stuff in there. So have you ever gone the other way and all of a sudden now you've taken too much out?
Not me. That's not my style. No, I like my narrative exposition and my detail.
Mine. I lose character spatial anchoring. So they after get stuck in the dialogue or and you forget where they are and what they're are they sitting, standing, what's happening here, or are they just floating in some void?
Yes.
And in science fiction, you do want to drop in a few things here and there. And so when I'm going back and editing, that's usually when I'll have to stir in a bit of, Indy gesticulated wildly, and unfortunately, it propelled her back in the zero gravity and bumped her into something. So you just got the little tidbits of things that remind you of where they are.
Right. I call it green screen writing when a writer is so focused on dialogue and just point of view character movements that it looks like a script instead of a novel. It's like somebody dropped the green screen down and we're waiting for the animators to come in and fill in everything around it. And I've also seen manuscripts where, it might be like a historical romance, but there's never any description of clothing. So you might know, okay, we're in the drawing room and the fire's going and the wind is blowing, but you never see the furnishings or the costuming. And that's such a part of that genre of historical fiction that you want that kind of tactile experience of heavy silks, woolens, brocades, tapestries on the stone walls, and you lose something sensory when those elements aren't described as a reader.
I think you hit the nail on the head there as well. There's definitely genre expectations that will lose some. I mean, take Tom Clancy for example. Who I think people have said quite rudely, one of his books reads more like a submarine operating manual than it does a story. But there are those people who are absolutely, obsessed with that kind of detail. And if you don't provide it in some of those genres, then you'll lose readers. So you definitely need to know who you're writing for as well.
Yeah,
and the other
if
thing
you are writing for the hardcore science fiction reader or the hardcore fantasy reader or the hardcore historical romance reader, they're going to want that sensory experience. Absolutely.
Yeah, you didn't tell us how the magic worked. I need to know how the magic works.
That's right.
The other thing as well that occurred to me is I know that this is where I've lost some balance, is too much action. Not enough downtime in between high action. And so I think it's exciting because it's what I like to read. But even I don't like to read a book that's just chapter after chapter after chapter. You just think, oh my God, when are they going to ever go to the bathroom or have something?
Or sleep or, yes. Or your action hero gets wound after wound after wound and never slows down. And you're like, okay, seriously?
I'm pretty sure he lost a leg 3 chapters ago.
Yeah, but he's not limping.
There's no time for prosthetics. It kind of feels like this is something you can kind of like visually scan for. Like, hey, I wonder if I have too much blah, right? Look, 17 pages with no dialogue breaks.
Right.
Or 3 chapters with no downtime. Like, you can almost just like visually scan for it and be able to find those moments.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's when it's a great idea to print your manuscript and get out a highlighter and physically mark it up. I think when we read, our eyes are so used to moving over the page and our brains to taking in this story that we can kind of stop tracking the thing we're looking for, but if you're physically pausing to mark something up on the paper, then, you've got the physical kinesthetic connection there. So you don't just start reading for reading's sake and you keep doing the work of looking for that balance point, that element where you're either heavy or light.
Right, because if you have written it well, and if it is good stuff, right, like interesting world building or interesting things within your genre that your readers will like, your beta readers might come back with, I really liked it, it was interesting, and they don't know really why. Maybe the pacing was off or whatever, because for them, like, they enjoyed the world building portion, even if it was a little bit too much in places, right?
Right.
So.
Right, and if you wrote it heavy on world building or action or procedural because that's the thing you love, then you might also be a little bit blind to it. So unless you go really left brain and, get technical and physical and mark that up. If you mark all of your action sequences in a highlighter and then you lay out some pages on your table and it's just like yellow, like a big neon sign, okay, you might have a balance issue. So... Anything else we want to say about balance, tipping the scales?
Something I did, and I still do to some degree as well, depending on the story. But where I had one where there were, we've talked about this a bit before with the villain disappearing off the page. When I did my revision, the first thing I did was list all of the scenes in a kind of a reverse beat sheet, so you're going back and reverse engineering it, and I color coded each of them from the point of whose point of view it was, and seeing if I was getting enough variety. And so I'd have sometimes huge, great big long strings or sequences of just being in one person's point of view for a multi POV story, and that can be a warning sign. It isn't necessarily always bad, but sometimes then if it's a sudden, you're whipped back into the other character's point of view and you just spent 10 chapters with this one, you go, oh, that might be a warning sign there. So that was another visual way. That's what Kathryn triggered that idea that yes, you can always do it from a mapping point of view as well. Have a look at the balance, and you could do, and that was just from POV. But as you say, Alida, you could highlight portions that are setting and portions that are action. Yeah, if you print it out. I find Scrivener very useful for that. I do use labels and scene colors in Scrivener to help me determine either who's POV or where or locations.
Right. Yeah. And if you do something like that and you find out, hey, like I've been over here for 10 chapters and now I'm moving over, and you want to keep it like that, that may be a place where you can actually slow down a little bit and give a little more world building or give a little more, of that re-immersion, even if it's in the same world, right? Because you're reestablishing that point of view and that character's voice. So,
yeah, lots of tools.
I think it is one of those things, isn't it? It's, as you said, Alida, you can be blind to it yourself anyway. And so it is a question of, well, what tool is the most appropriate? And by the sound of it, we all use multiple tools to just make sure that by the time you polish it up, it's just right. I guess it's like finishing a painting or something. What you start out with is an idea, and it gets broadly filled in. Then you come back, and then you add the highlights, and then you look and you think, no, that's still not quite right. There's something about the perspective that's not right there. So you add in something else. So I think it's not dissimilar. I mean, and sometimes it's been as simple as moving something around. If it's big and blocky, actually, I still like that, but it would fit a little later on or a little earlier. So it's not necessarily that you're always putting things on the cutting room floor either. It's a bit of judicious rearranging can work.
Right. If you've done, back to the world building idea, if you've done a long description of the world, something like a portal fantasy where the point of view character is new to the world, and so the reader discovers along with that character. So you've got long descriptions of what this character is seeing, encountering, tasting, whatever. You can take that and break up how the character moves through the world and how the character encounters those things, so it isn't such a long sequence of them, and get more action, more drama, more tension as we go through those elements of the world. All right. I guess that's all we have to say on striking balance. We've been reduced to nodding. Yep. All right. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.